Do you think he's altered his appearance at all?
Again, I don't know.
Have you sighted him at all anywhere? Have there been any reliable reports?
No.
After more than 50 years of unanswered questions, the mystery that has haunted Britain like a ghost from its aristocratic past has finally begun to unravel. The disappearance of Lord Lucan, once whispered about in drawing rooms and splashed across tabloid headlines, has long stood as one of the most perplexing crimes in modern history. For decades, people speculated, invented theories, and traded rumors about what became of the man accused of orchestrating one of the most shocking domestic attacks in London's elite quarters. Now, with science finally stepping in where speculation once reigned, the fog of myth is beginning to lift. DNA analysis has cracked open a door many thought would remain sealed forever, and what it reveals is darker and more disturbing than even the most cynical investigators dared to imagine. It suggests that Lucan may not have perished shortly after the terrible events of that November night in Belgravia. Instead, he may have lived on, hidden, shielded, or aided by those who benefited from his survival, turning a crime into a decades-long deception that still unsettles the public. For the family of Sandra Rivet, the devoted nanny whose life was brutally cut short, the confirmation is both a grim vindication and a reopening of wounds that never truly healed. For the British public, it is a reminder of the corrosive power of privilege and the way certain men seem to bend the rules of justice itself. Lucan, once a ghostly figure of aristocratic intrigue, is no longer simply a missing person in history's footnotes. He is now a symbol of how wealth and power can shield someone, even in the aftermath of a heinous crime. The reemergence of this truth forces us to reconsider not only the man himself, but the entire world he represented, one of glamour, gambling, secrecy, and violent control hidden behind the polished veneer of respectability. The story begins with a night that changed everything, November 7th, 1974. At first glance, it was like any other chilly evening in Belgravia, one of London's most exclusive neighborhoods. The elegant Georgian townhouses stood in perfect rows, their facades whispering of centuries of prestige, cultivated wealth, and the sort of stability only money could buy. But behind one of those immaculate doors at 46 Lower Belgrave Street, the polished surface of aristocratic calm would shatter into a nightmare that would grip the nation for decades. Sandra Rivet was a 29-year-old nurse and nanny, wholly devoted to the Lucan children. That evening, she had descended the narrow staircase into the basement kitchen, a space meant for the quiet routines of domestic life, the clinking of teacups, the hum of ordinary comfort. She was preparing a simple cup of tea, likely thinking of nothing more than the tasks of her evening. But in the space of seconds, her world was invaded by violence as sudden as it was deliberate. An attacker lay in wait, armed not with a gun or a knife, but with something far more chilling in its calculated simplicity. A lead pipe, wrapped in plaster to avoid splintering, transformed into a crude but devastating weapon. The blows were swift, brutal, and purposeful. This was not a frantic act of impulse, but a premeditated attempt to eliminate a witness, or perhaps to remove a perceived obstacle standing between a man and his control over his fractured family. As Sandra fell beneath the weight of the attack, her life spilling away in a basement that should have been safe, events upstairs took an equally horrific turn. Lady Veronica Lucan, Lucan's estranged wife, entered the home unaware of the carnage below. She had endured years of tension, the erosion of her marriage under the weight of her husband's gambling addictions, his unpredictable temper, and the slow collapse of the life she had once imagined. That night, she became a direct target. The assailant turned his fury upon her, bludgeoning her with the same methodical violence. Severe head injuries, blood matting her hair, confusion and agony mixing in the shock of betrayal. Yet somehow, against all odds, she survived. Driven by sheer instinct, she wrenched herself free and fled into the cold November night. Her screams echoed down Belgravia's cobbled streets, shattering the quiet, refined atmosphere and summoning neighbors who rushed to her aid. It was a moment that transformed personal tragedy into a very public scandal, forcing the hidden violence of an aristocratic home into the full glare of national attention. Within hours, The Metropolitan Police were piecing together what had happened inside that townhouse. Their focus immediately settled on Lord Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan, a man who, until then, had been a familiar figure among Britain's upper class, charming, well-dressed, a gambler known for his daring and recklessness at John Aspinall's Claremont Club. His reputation was one of charisma and calculated risk, a man who straddled the worlds of nobility and high-stakes gaming with ease. Yet beneath that cultivated surface lay mounting financial pressures, legal struggles, and an unraveling personal life. To detectives, the profile was chillingly clear. He had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had the temperament for violence masked by Polish. But before they could close in on him, Lucan vanished. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. His disappearance added a new dimension to the horror, transforming what might have been remembered as a terrible domestic tragedy into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. A man once seen at the finest tables of London society had slipped into the shadows, leaving behind his children, a murdered nanny, a wounded wife, and a stunned nation. The media descended with a frenzy, amplifying every rumor and detail. The idea that a titled aristocrat, a man who had dined and gambled among the country's elite, could also be a murderer now on the run, electrified the public imagination. The contrast between Lucan's carefully maintained image of glamour and the blood-stained reality of what he had allegedly done was almost impossible to reconcile. Yet the evidence pointed directly to him. By nightfall, Belgravia had ceased to be simply a bastion of wealth and privilege. It had become the epicenter of a story that mixed murder, mystery, and social commentary in equal measure. The killing of Sandra Rivet, the attack on Lady Lucan, and the disappearance of the man at the heart of it all created a scandal that has never truly faded from Britain's consciousness. It was not just a crime. It was a rupture in the very fabric of how people perceived power, accountability, and justice. A violent act within the walls of privilege, followed by an escape that would ripple across decades, reshaping how the public viewed the untouchable world of the aristocracy. Lucan's vanishing act triggered one of the most frantic and widespread manhunts in British history, a pursuit that blended the urgency of criminal investigation with the surreal quality of chasing a phantom. Within hours of his disappearance, Scotland Yard mobilized across London, combing through the city's arteries, train stations, airports, docks, searching for any trace of the Earl who had seemingly dissolved into thin air. Yet the harder authorities looked, the more elusive he became. For the first time, the public was witnessing the collapse of certainty. How could a man so prominent, so recognizable, slip through the cracks so completely? That very impossibility only fueled the mystery. What followed was a patchwork of reports, each one carrying with it a sense of possibility and frustration. Sightings trickled in from around the globe. A man in Hong Kong whose bearing seemed aristocratic. A figure in Bombay glimpsed in a crowded street. Whispers of a quiet guest in a remote Australian outpost. Even a mysterious visitor in Devon who carried himself with unusual reserve. Every lead was taken seriously, pursued with intensity, and yet each one dissipated like smoke the moment investigators arrived. The tips ranged from credible to fantastical, and as weeks stretched into months, a pattern emerged. Lucan had become less a person than an idea, a ghost projected onto strangers wherever the imagination needed him to be. The press, eager to keep the story alive, seized on every rumor. Newspapers printed speculative maps charting Lucan's supposed movements, while television broadcasts replayed his portrait again and again, embedding his features into the national consciousness. Public fascination grew not just from the crime itself, but from the very fact that the suspect was absent, ungraspable. Here was a man of status and refinement, someone who should have been most visible, now wielding invisibility like a weapon. It challenged every assumption about class and accountability. Could an aristocrat truly vanish while under suspicion of murder? And if so, who had helped him? As the years passed, the hunt became less about immediate justice and more about endurance. The police, though diligent, could not sustain the same intensity forever. Into the void stepped private detectives, journalists, even amateur sleuths, all desperate to uncover the truth. Some swore Lucan had assumed false identities, moving quietly from country to country, hiding in plain sight. Others believed he had been sheltered by members of his social circle, powerful allies who valued loyalty above law, who closed ranks to protect one of their own. These theories painted a picture not just of Lucan's escape, but of an entire system complicit in his disappearance, a conspiracy woven into the fabric of privilege. The more time passed, the more the lines between fact and fiction blurred. Lucan became a man who lived in anecdotes rather than reality. Letters surfaced. Photographs claimed to show him older and more weathered. Diary entries hinted at secret encounters. But each supposed piece of evidence collapsed under scrutiny. The myth of Lucan grew stronger precisely because the truth could not be pinned down. He was everywhere and nowhere, an aristocratic phantom haunting airports, casinos, beach resorts, and small towns alike. For the families involved, the passage of time brought no closure. Sandra Rivet's relatives were forced to endure not only their grief, but also the endless retelling of her murder as a footnote to Lucan's legend. For Lady Lucan, survival meant a lifetime marked by trauma and suspicion, her name forever bound to the man who had nearly killed her. Meanwhile, Lucan's own children grew up in the shadow of uncertainty, their father's absence both a scandal and an unspeakable wound. The silence of his disappearance became a legacy as potent as any presence could have been. By the late 20th century, the investigation had begun to stall. No credible sightings had materialized, and theories grew increasingly desperate. Had Lucan taken his own life shortly after fleeing, his body hidden or destroyed before it could be discovered? Or had he, with meticulous calculation, orchestrated a life beyond Britain's borders, slipping into obscurity while the world obsessed over his whereabouts? By 1999, the courts declared him legally dead, passing his estate and title to his son, George Bingham. On paper, at least, the matter was closed. But in reality, it solved nothing. The declaration was a legal convenience, not a factual conclusion. Even with this official closure, the essential questions refused to die. In the absence of a body, the mystery only deepened. If Lucan had indeed survived, then for decades he had succeeded in outwitting not only Scotland Yard, but also the collective vigilance of a fascinated public. If he had died, then his disappearance remained a masterclass in vanishing without a trace. Either way, the case stood as an enduring embarrassment for investigators and a testament to the enduring grip of myth. For the public, Lord Lucan ceased to be simply a man and instead became a symbol of impunity, of privilege, of the strange immunity granted to those born into power. His story was no longer confined to crime reports, but entered the realm of cultural folklore. He was compared to figures of Gothic fiction, a real-world phantom whose crime and disappearance were retold in countless articles, books, and documentaries. Each retelling added new layers, new interpretations, further entwining fact and imagination until they became indistinguishable. From the polished streets of Belgravia to the far corners of the world, Lucan's name carried with it the chill of unresolved horror. He was not just the suspect in a murder case. He was the embodiment of unanswered questions, the very idea of escape itself. To this day, the Lucan case represents more than a failure to catch a fugitive. It is a story about the fragility of truth, the reach of wealth, and the unsettling possibility that some men, through charm, privilege, or sheer luck, can slip beyond the grasp of justice entirely. The deeper investigators and journalists dug into the Lucan household, the clearer it became that what happened on that November night was not a sudden eruption of chaos, but the culmination of years of tension, suspicion, and unhappiness. Behind the polished facade of Belgravia life, John Bingham and Veronica Duncan were waging a silent war that slowly consumed them both. Their marriage had started like a fairy tale. The handsome aristocrat and the charming young woman swept into the glittering whirl of London high society. But money, pride, and personality differences soon began to tear that image apart. Lucan had an image of himself that was grand, imperious, and utterly fixed. He envisioned a life filled with clubs, cards, power, and social standing. Veronica, however, longed for stability, warmth, and escape from the suffocating expectations of the aristocracy. When those visions collided, the home they shared slowly transformed into a battleground. Accounts from those who knew them paint a picture of a man who grew increasingly cold and controlling. Lucan was obsessed with appearances, with maintaining the aura of wealth and prestige even as his finances crumbled. The family's money had dwindled, his gambling losses mounted, and his obsession with regaining a fortune at the casino table drove him into a constant cycle of anxiety. Friends described Veronica as fragile, worn down by his indifference, and later by the stress of their bitter separation. She was prescribed medication for depression, which only gave Lucan more fuel for his claim that she was unstable, unfit to raise their children. He told anyone who would listen that Veronica was mentally unwell, dangerous even, and he insisted that the children needed rescuing from her care. But to outsiders, his claims felt less like concern, and more like strategy, an attempt to win sympathy in court, and tilt custody in his favor. What truly haunted investigators later was the sense that Lucan saw his estranged wife not as a person, but as an obstacle. In the glittering world of the Claremont Club, where Lucan and his peers gathered nightly to gamble vast sums of money, the talk was often of power and control, of strategies both on and off the gaming table. Some suggested Lucan approached his crumbling marriage with the same cold calculation he used at the baccarat table. Divorce proceedings had left him drained financially and emotionally. Custody battles were looming, and each loss in court only deepened his desperation. Witnesses later recalled that he seemed obsessed, almost consumed, with the idea of reclaiming his children at any cost. The Lucan household itself revealed chilling details after the crime. There were testimonies that he had been spying on Veronica, watching the house, and even following the nanny's routines. Police would later speculate that Lucan intended to kill Veronica, perhaps staging the murder as something else, and that the nanny, Sandra Rivet, was tragically killed because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sandra had been working only part-time and was new to the household routine, which may explain why Lucan mistook her for Veronica in the darkened basement. This theory gave rise to the most disturbing possibility, that the attack was not spontaneous at all, but carefully planned. The notion that an aristocrat, desperate and cornered, might plot the murder of his wife in order to regain control of his children sent shockwaves through Britain. Those who knew Veronica later testified to her fear. Friends remembered her saying she felt watched, that Lucan was trying to paint her as insane in order to discredit her. She confided in others that she was terrified he might try to harm her. But because of the family's status and the reluctance of many in high society to intervene in the private affairs of the wealthy, those fears went largely unheeded. When Sandra was killed, Veronica's suspicions suddenly seemed prophetic. In the aftermath, she told police and doctors that Lucan had attacked her, that she had fought him off, and that he had fled. Her words carried the weight of someone who had been bracing for this very moment. The press latched onto these revelations, and suddenly the Lucan case was no longer just about a missing lord. It was about domestic violence, privilege, and the lengths to which a man might go to preserve his image. For the public, it was almost too surreal. A peer of the realm, educated at Eton, born into money, now accused of butchering a nanny and attempting to kill his wife. It shattered the notion that wealth and status could insulate one from desperation or brutality, and yet some in Lucan's circle refused to believe he was capable of such violence. They portrayed him as a wronged man, driven to despair by a vindictive wife, and even suggested that he had been framed or provoked. These competing narratives, was he a calculating murderer or a desperate father pushed too far, added to the air of mystery that has never fully lifted. As the years passed and the story took on mythic proportions, the household's secrets became almost as important as the crime itself. They revealed a portrait of a marriage poisoned by pride, a man whose addiction to gambling left him hollow and paranoid, and a woman who tried to hold her family together even as she was vilified by her husband's allies. Each revelation made the public question not only what had happened in that basement, but also what kind of man Lord Lucan really was. Was he the charming gambler who lit up London's elite clubs, or the cold, violent figure described by his estranged wife? The truth seemed to flicker somewhere in between, unresolved, and perhaps forever unknowable. By the mid-1970s, the case was no longer just a crime story. It was a parable about privilege, power, and the dangers of obsession. The secrets of the Lucan household painted a disturbing picture, one that explained not only the murder itself, but also why the mystery of Lord Lucan has lingered in Britain's imagination for half a century. The custody battles between John Bingham, 7th Earl of Lucan, and Veronica Duncan were not just legal proceedings. They were the slow unraveling of a family under siege. After their separation, the children became pawns in a bitter contest of wills. Lucan was determined to portray himself as the stable, capable parent, while painting Veronica as unstable and unfit. He brought witnesses, spoke of her depression, and repeated the narrative that she was a danger to herself and others. But the courts, weighing the evidence, often sided with Veronica. She was awarded custody, though Lucan was granted visitation. To a man consumed by pride, accustomed to winning in the world of clubs and aristocratic society, this was not just a legal defeat, it was a humiliation. The more the courts rejected him, the more Lucan seemed to spiral. Friends reported that he was constantly talking about the custody issue, obsessed with how to rescue his children from Veronica's care. His finances were collapsing from years of gambling losses, and the life he had once enjoyed, glamorous parties, the gaming tables at the Claremont Club, the deference of those who saw him as an aristocrat of impeccable standing, was slipping away. To Lucan, the custody losses may have felt like the final blow to his identity. In his world, where appearances meant everything, being cut off from his children and painted as an irresponsible gambler was intolerable. Investigators would later speculate that the custody battle provided both the motive and the pressure that drove him toward violence. Killing Veronica, some believed, would not only remove the obstacle to custody, but also silence the woman who was tarnishing his reputation. It is a grim and unsettling theory, but one that gained strength when police uncovered evidence that Lucan had been watching Veronica's home and seemed to know the household routines. This was not a crime of sudden passion. It was, many believed, the desperate act of a man who saw no other way forward. But even in the aftermath, the question of motive was clouded by the mythology that grew around Lord Lucan. His allies, many of them wealthy aristocrats themselves, were reluctant to accept that one of their own could commit such a brutal act. Some insisted that he was being unfairly vilified, that Veronica was exaggerating her claims, that perhaps the real target was someone else entirely. Others whispered of conspiracies, that Lucan had been framed, or that he had been helped to escape not because he was guilty, but because he was a victim of circumstances. The truth became entangled in the competing narratives of high society loyalty, public outrage, and the tantalizing mystery of a lord who had simply vanished. Veronica's testimony, however, remained consistent. She described in vivid detail how Lucan had attacked her, how she had fought him off, how she had seen Sandra Rivet lying dead in the basement. Her words carried the weight of lived fear, and they formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, even though Lucan himself was never put on trial. For Veronica, the aftermath was a lonely and harrowing ordeal. She was left to raise her children under the cloud of scandal, to endure the whispers of those who sided with Lucan, and to carry the trauma of that night for the rest of her life. The closing chapter of the Lucan case is, in many ways, defined by absence. There was no body, no arrest, no trial, just a string of reported sightings around the world. Lucan in Australia, in South Africa, in India, in South America. Each new rumor reignited the public's fascination. Some believed he had been spirited away by his aristocratic friends, hidden in plain sight among the colonies of British expats. Others thought he had taken his own life shortly after the crime, his body buried in some unmarked grave, the mystery left to fuel endless speculation. What made the case so haunting was that both possibilities seemed equally plausible. The law eventually caught up with the legend. In 1999, an inquest formally named Lord Lucan as Sandra Rivet's killer, the first member of the House of Lords to be found guilty of murder in absentia. Decades later, in 2016, he was declared legally dead. Yet for the British public, these legal pronouncements did not end the story. If anything, they only deepened the sense of intrigue. For how could a man of such prominence with his face splashed across newspapers simply disappear without a trace? How could the police, Interpol, and countless journalists fail to track him down? The mystery seemed to mock the very idea of justice. Looking back now, the Lucan case feels less like a crime story and more like a Gothic tale, one where wealth, pride, and desperation collided in a way that left only questions. The murder of Sandra Rivet remains a tragedy, an innocent woman caught in the crossfire of a family's war. Veronica's survival is a testament to her resilience, though she carried the scars for the rest of her life. And Lucan himself, whether he died in obscurity or lived out his days under another name, remains frozen in the public imagination as both villain and ghost. In the end, the story of Lord Lucan is about more than just one night of violence. It is about the corrosive power of privilege, the way desperation can twist a man's mind, and the enduring hunger for mystery in a world that craves answers. Half a century later, people still speak his name with a mixture of fascination and dread. Lord Lucan, the aristocrat who vanished, the father who turned on his family, the man who slipped into legend.